Good morning, ladies. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gabriel, and with my colleague Avinash, we will be your MCs for this conference. This morning, we begin with the opening challenge, Techno-Nationalism Saving Positive Sum Technology from the Zero-Sum Challenge with Mr. George Yeo. A warm welcome to our participants joining us in Raffles Hotel and to all those viewing online. This morning, George Yeo will deliver his remarks, Dr. Adam Posen will give his response, and will moderate a discussion with the audience. During the discussion, if you have any questions, please proceed to the standing microphones that will be placed in the aisles, or raise your hand so one of our ushers can come to you for microphone. Online participants are invited to leave their questions in the chat box. Please identify yourself with your name, title, and organization. Anonymous questions will not be entertained. In view of the limited time, we ask for your kind cooperation in keeping questions concise. To begin, I would now like to welcome on stage Dr. Adam Posen, President of the Peterson Institute. Dr. Posen, please.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and evening to our friends joining online throughout the world. This is the opening of the Next Step Conference, a joint effort of the LKY School of Public Policy in Singapore and the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And as we had a wonderful discussion last night with the Foreign Minister, Minister Vivian, we've grounded our topics very well and the reason that we're gathering, convening here in Singapore very well, that the potential conflict we saw coming over a year ago when we first started planning this discussion has escalated very rapidly, unfortunately. And that is, of course, primarily, but not solely, a China-US conflict. Both COVID and Russia's barbaric invasion of Ukraine have accelerated that process and reinforced it and given both good and bad reasons for that. And the spirit of the Next Step Conference, which, again, this is the first of what will be an annual series, is embodied in the name. Next Step, S-T-E-P, is solutions to economic problems. And it also means step by step, that we are not looking to wishfully take the world away from where it is right now, but we're looking to pragmatically take steps to make the world a better place. And that is a place where the Lee Kuan Yew School and the Peterson Institute share a mission. But also, as those of you participating in person know, this conference is meant to cut across groups. We have people from Southeast and North Asia. We have people from Europe and the US. We have people from industry, from academia, from think tanks, from finance, and from government. We have people who are at the early stage of their careers, and we have eminence gris who are giving their wisdom. I'd like to think I still fall somewhere in between on that. The point is to have next steps that matter. We have to have a sense of reality. We have to have many voices. We have to think hard and inclusively. Both pieces, thinking hard and inclusively. And so we're hopeful by having this combination of people of different views and experiences that the practical insights we'll be able to generate together this year as a community in between the annual conferences and in coming years will be able to make a difference. And that is why after this session with the distinguished George Yeo, we will be moving to closed sessions on Chatham House rules to facilitate open, frank discussion. We welcome people who wish to join this community to apply now for the slots for next year's conference, which will be even bigger and more exciting. And even if they listen to all the steps we propose, the problems will not have gone away. What I would like to do before turning the podium over to George Yeo is to introduce my friend and colleague of longstanding Danny Quah, who is, of course, the Shing Professor of Economics and the Dean at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. It's hard to do justice to Danny. He is first and earliest in his career a truly brilliant economist. Work he did with our colleague at Peterson, Olivier Blanchard, still set the standard for macroeconometric thinking in an applied way, and has done many contributions since. His research interests lie in income inequality, economic growth, and international economic relations. But more than his CV, he has gone on to be a true leader, both formally in his role as Dean at the Lee Kuan Yew School, in previous roles at the London School of Economics, as a member of the Council on Malaysia's National Economic Advisors Council, in many informal ways around the world and in the economics profession, as a leader in the schools of international affairs, and most of all, and to my mind, as an exemplar of how you be open to ideas from many spaces, how you be rigorous in your thinking but not threatening or bullying, how you be public-spirited but pragmatic. Danny was kind enough to refer to me in his introduction to me last night as having sensible and sane positions. Danny certainly has those, but even more so, he has the empathy to bridge those positions with the people he encounters throughout the world. And so I personally am very grateful, and we are very fortunate to be partnered with the LKY School and with Dean Danny Quah. Danny.
It's okay, thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, both here and online. For many of us, these are grim times when we think about the global economy. Many factors enter that assessment. Geopolitical rivalry is one of many challenges the global economy now faces. But you know, when many economists hear the words geopolitical competition, their first reaction might be, that's great, bring it. Because you see, for economists, the word competition means something quite different from the way the word competition is used in many other discussions. Economic competition, which we're going to get to in this session, thanks to George Yeo's opening speech in a few minutes, economic competition is where you get ahead by improving yourself, by raising your own productivity. If you're a nation, through investing in your schools, succeeding at research and development, investing in public infrastructure, improving your people's human capital by developing skills and training them. This kind of competition, economic competition, makes us all work harder and at the end benefits everyone. This kind of competition is positive sum. This is the kind of competition that economists have in mind when they think optimistically about geopolitical competition. However, that is not all that is implied by the term geopolitical competition today, but actually not just today, but throughout history. Instead, a different kind of competition figures prominently. Let me refer to that as security competition. Security competition is where you get ahead by keeping others down, by encircling and containing others, by restricting the availability to them of frontier technologies. That is the background that I come into listening to this speech by George Yeo this morning. Of course, some will say we have to engage in this second kind of competition, what you call security competition, because the win-lose outcome is so important. the win-lose outcome is so consequential, is of such existential significance that everything at their disposal must be brought to bear to guarantee that they are the one who gets ahead. This kind of competition is zero-sum. Someone wins only when someone else loses. Techno-nationalism, which we're going to be unpacking throughout this conference, that we're going to get into in this opening session, is a thinking that connects a nation's well-being and security to its capabilities in frontier technologies. It mixes and matches economic and security competition. And as all of us assess the contours of this new geopolitical rivalry, we want to view the world, yes, recognizing that part of this discourse is going to be zero-sum, but we want to view the world in a way that steers clear of the other kind of zero-based thinking, a thinking that is 0-1, that is binary, that is black and white, yes or no. Competition can be only either economic competition or security competition. The right question instead might be, what mix, what convex combination of economic and security competition is the right one for each of our nations and for the world as a whole? So as our Next Step 2022 conference begins on techno-nationalism and changing prospects for prosperity, we are delighted and privileged to get to hear from Mr. George Yeo, visiting scholar at the Lee Kuan Yew School, formerly Singapore's Minister for Foreign Affairs. After Mr. Yeo retired from politics in 2011, he had joined Carrier Logistics Network as its chairman and executive director. In 2019, he stepped down from Carrier Logistics to spend more time once again in Singapore. We are honored indeed to have him at our Lee Kuan Yew School and to have him at this conference. Mr. Yeo will deliver an opening speech on techno-nationalism, positive-sum technology, and the zero-sum challenge, after which he will be in conversation with Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Please join your hands together and help me welcome to the stage Mr. George Yeo.
Thank you, Danny, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming so early for my address to you. We are in a great transition, and it's important during this period of upheaval to envisage the future that will be homeostatic, which is more or less stable. But to arrive there will be a rough ride. And maybe this looming economic crisis that we see before us will be part of the process, part of the creative destruction taking us there. I think it will inevitably be a multipolar world. The US recoils against it because it's used to being dominant for a very long time. I think it tries very hard to preserve its position by cobbling together a Western alliance. But I don't think, despite all these efforts, we can prevent a multipolar world from emerging. It's just the logic of numbers. And perhaps, historically speaking, a little unnatural. In matters of technology, of high technology, of cutting-edge technology, it is never positive sum. Warfare is zero sum. Either you win or I win. And it's a matter of life and death. I was in the military for many years, And it's natural that those who are planning for war will explore the limits of technology. And therefore, if you have in your possession technology or secrets or knowledge which others don't have, you keep it and you protect it by the highest secrecy. So we should not at all be surprised by this. I mean, China had a monopoly of paper for many centuries that enabled them to organize more people than anybody else on earth, and therefore to mobilize resources in a way which no one else could, and therefore to apply pressure at particular points of an intensity which no one else could replicate. So when it was organized, it was always awesome. But when the reverse process happened, well, the decline was equally awesome. So China goes through long cycles. It also had a monopoly of gunpowder for a very long time. In the case of paper, you only lost it in the 8th century when the Tang army, which was in Central Asia, clashed with the Abbasids, moving eastwards. And among the Chinese prisoners caught, some knew how to make paper. And once the knowledge of paper entered the Islamic world, it transformed the Islamic world, creating a completely different civilization. And it took centuries before eventually that technology reached Umayyad Spain, and from there it leached into Northern Europe, which laid the basis for the Renaissance. So you can keep a secret for a long time, but eventually it leaches out. Gunpowder, they kept a secret for much longer, until the time of the Mongol invasion. And it kept the Mongols at bay longer than anywhere else on earth. But eventually, that also leached out, and in the end, it was used against China. So we should not be overly excited about the fact that the US today is trying all means to prevent China from getting critical technologies. If the technologies are developed by the state, then it's easier to keep it a secret. But if the technology begins as commercial technology, which then gets put to military use, then trying to keep secret what has already gone out into the market, it's much more difficult. So all these attempts at long-arm jurisdiction to get other countries to prevent certain technologies from reaching China, these attempts will delay the process, but not for very long, because it's too leaky. And many of those involved in developing that technology are ethnic Chinese. And they have certain affection for China. And the more anti-China the US becomes, the more they feel uncomfortable, even in the US. And some of them, a small minority, will say, well, I should help my mother country. So if military R&D is done within the military establishment, like stealth technology, then it's much easier to keep it a secret. But if it is in chip technology, which begins in Silicon Valley and then gets produced in a complicated worldwide manufacturing process and distribution, I think it's very difficult. But I think the US will try. It will try until it fails, and then the transition will continue, and a new world emerges. China is aware of its own strength, so in a sense, it is playing defensively. It knows that in the end, it will become the biggest economy on earth, and in some areas, it will overtake the US. But it doesn't want to clash, even when it reaches that position, because it's too old a civilization. It knows that if it does that, you only bring troubles upon itself. The Chinese mentality is one of building walls. They like the world to be a Chinese world among themselves. It's much easier to govern, it's much easier to manage. So if I have to lock down, yeah, the Shanghainese will cry blue murder, they are traumatized. But in the end, they comply. You can't do that in Singapore. You certainly can't do that in Florida or in London. because they're Chinese. And they know in their history that disunity can lead to generations of hardship. So they put up with a lot of nonsense. I mean, what some of us may consider nonsense, but of course, from the viewpoint of the leaders in China, for good reason. The reasons for which are not always fully disclosed to their own people. But in that multipolar world, China has got used to the fact that you'll be a genuinely multipolar world, and not a world where China is the biggest, fattest pole, and everyone else orbits around it. So in the old days, you visit China, you've got to do your kowtow 9 times. And then the emperor may deign to see you. So in 1793, when during the time of George III, who gave independence to the US, Lord Macartney went to Qing, China, to ask for an audience with the emperor, the Qinglong emperor, who was a fearsome man. Chinese said, well, you have to kowtow, you have to kowtow. He said, I don't kowtow to my own king. How can I kowtow to your emperor? So after Ajibaji, they agreed on a 1-knee bow. And the Chinese said, okay, then he bowed before an empty throne. And he went back empty-handed. The gifts he brought along, the Chinese dismissed as useless things, none of which China did not already have, in abundance. It was the height of arrogance, which always suggests that it was the beginning of decline. And, well, within a few decades, China was in precipitous decline. Lord Macartney he went to China directly from the Pearl River Delta straight to Tianjin, from Tianjin to Beijing. But when he returned, he decided, in order not to waste his journey, to collect intelligence. So he came back through the Grand Canal, down to the Yangtze. I think he went to Hangzhou. At every step, he took copious records. At every step, Qing Dynasty officials monitored his movement. So all records are kept. And interesting books have been written about his journey. And later on, they provided critical intelligence for the British when they subdued China during the Opium War. So intelligence is always important in the art of war. It occupies the entire last chapter, which is about spies. All warfare is based on an information advantage. And the US have had an information advantage. It was unbelievable until Edward Snowden leaked it to the world. I think even in our wildest imagination, we could not imagine the US having such a capability, the results of which it shared with its Five Eyes partners. So I can understand why the US should be very angry with Edward Snowden. But if I were an ordinary American, I'm not so sure. And as a Singaporean, I'm glad that Edward Snowden told us what he did. And having used to such a almost free access to every corridor, every room, every cupboard, every drawer, every pocket, suddenly to find that you have ZTE and Huawei locking them up, it's very upsetting. The first move was against ZTE. Xi spoke to Trump. Trump relented. I think China paid $1 billion or something. And so nothing happened there. But when the move was made against Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of the founder of Huawei, Trump himself, who was hosting Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago, did not know. So a move to kill Huawei, I don't think it can succeed, because Huawei has an internal market which is huge. It's not about mobile phones, it's not about technology, it's about intelligence. And the Chinese, and the US fears that the Chinese will do what they have been used to doing, which I'm sure the Chinese will also want to do if they can. So naturally, this game it's nothing new. I mean, many of us were read Mad comics, black spy versus white spy, and how they try to outdo each other. I mean, this is an endless game. But it's a little painful watching the US as it is today. It reminds me a little of a movie I watched as a kid, I think Ben-Hur. You remember the chariot race? And the lead charioteer knew that Ben-Hur was overtaking him, and he did everything he could to prevent the guy behind from overtaking. I think the US behavior is a little like that today. And I do not know whether many Americans are aware that the way Asians look at America has turned sharply negative. Many of us who were schooled in America, in my case, who had life saved in America, who grew up with a deep affection for America, are very troubled by what we see today. And we're not sure where the country is going. America has a great advantage in technology, in chip technology, in AI, in biotech. It wants to preserve it at all costs, because its fears are not just economic. Its fears are in national security. And we all get dragged in. We're all somehow now being pushed, pressured, bamboozled one way or the other, and feeling the stress. China is trying to make sense of all this. US feels in its bones that China, when it becomes stronger, will be a threat. I don't agree with this, because China must be assessed in its own history. But I learned in the armed forces that capabilities can't change quickly. Intentions can overnight. So when you distrust a person, you assess him on the basis of his capability, not on the basis of his intention. And today, we live in a period of great distrust. And when we have such distrust of one another, well, we look at capabilities and we assume the worst. But that assumption sometimes leads us to wrong conclusions and to doing things that we should not do, and in creating the very tendencies which we rather not have come about in the first place. I mean, look at the Ukraine war. NATO thought it had a natural right to expand. The countries which were once under the heels of the Soviet Union wanted it to expand so that they could feel more secure. Russia kept blowing the whistle, saying that you can't do that. In the end, it moved. For small countries like Singapore, that is wrong. How could you just take territory like that? But there's a history to it. And in the end, if there's to be peace in that part of Eurasia, that peace must take into account the security of both Russia and Europe. But right now, politics is driven by mass emotions, and people are not thinking clearly about that future. So, in an atmosphere of deep distrust, move, counter move, counter move, everyone ends up in a position he'd rather not be in. And I see Russia, the US, Europe entering a very long dark tunnel. And there's no light that we can see at the end of that tunnel. And there's no easy way to reverse out that tunnel. Let's say we sit down to negotiate. The US cannot let Putin win. And Putin cannot lose. So how do you square that circle? I think China is determined not to enter that tunnel. So its stance is 60-40. 60% in favor of Russia, because if Russia collapses, China will feel much more pressure, but not beyond 60%. In the case of India, which is in a much more comfortable position, 50-50. It tries to benefit from both sides. So US hope that India will somehow be a strategic member of the Quad I think, has been brought to reality. Because India is a big country, and you always act in its own self-interest. The fact is, we've all got to live with one another. And living with one another means you have your aspirations, I have mine. In certain areas, we distrust each other, so we take precautions. In other areas, we work together for the common good. And we've got to develop an instinct that, in the end, with technology, it's one world, and we've got to live together. I look at the weaponization of space. Can you imagine if, when we go to the moon or go to Mars, we bring our weapons along? Not because we're afraid of aliens, but because we're afraid of one another. It can happen. That's what happened when the Europeans went to the Americas. They fought each other in the new continent. But over Antarctica, there was a wisdom that if we start doing that, we'll exhaust ourselves. So there's a treaty that Antarctica should be kept demilitarized and everyone have access. I say, work on the easy things. Let's demilitarize the moon and Mars. Low Earth orbit is too late to demilitarize. Middle Earth orbit may still be difficult, but higher Earth orbit, yes. We begin where it's easy and develop a pattern of communication. People must know one another. So even despite the Ukrainian conflict and almost breakdown in personal relationships, on the International Space Station, the US and Russia are still working together because their lives together depend on it. There is a deep, profound mutual dependence. And it's a relief that for the New START agreement on nuclear arms control, which was extended to 2026, that the inspection regime, which was suspended during COVID, is now being negotiated. The Deputy Director General of WTO, Gonzalez, is here. I spent many years of my life working to launch the new round. The most stressful periods of my life was invested in chairing agriculture at the WTO meetings in Seattle, in Cancun, and in Doha. Looking back, and I keep replaying the events in my mind. What took place, what could have been. Maybe we were tilting at windmills. The pendulum of globalization had reached its limit. And it had to move back. Perhaps we were too idealistic. After many years, my reflection is that we have become so used to Pax Americana. Post-Second World War, during the Cold War, the system that we lived in, and it was a pretty self-contained system, was an American system. Kept stable by American military capability, by American intelligence capability. Without US in the lead, there could not have been a GATT. Without US in the lead, there could not have been a WTO. And in Seattle, Cancun, Doha, I saw close up the role the US played in failure and success. When the US came to the conclusion that the global system which it created, which it called a global system, but which was really a US system, was no longer advantageous to the US, it decided, no, let's change it. But if it does it in a way which others see as selfish, the US will lose moral standing. But if the US takes the position that we're entering a multipolar world, and everything has got to be reconfigured to reflect multipolarity, whether it's a WTO, whether it is trade negotiations, whether it is the IMF, the World Bank, the international financial system. Then the other poles will say, yeah, that's in our interest too. But what we are seeing now is weaponization of everything, of the WTO, of the international financial system, of the US dollar. What we thought were public goods. If you are China and you look at all this, you will say, no, it will not be a multipolar world. It will be the US and the rest of us. The US with its Western friends and the rest of us. And we will develop our own responses. And we will have our own circles of friends. It will be a darker world for all of us. And it will make renewal in the US more difficult. Because remember, we may take external positions. We may bear the cost. We may grit our teeth and say, look, in this contest of wills, I will outlast you. The pressures turn back onto our own societies. And let's see which will fracture first. I think democracies have a disadvantage. I mean, look at Europe today, with the coming of winter. Who is more nervous? European leaders or Putin? Well, Putin need not be re-elected for a long time. Whereas for European leaders, you have to show a care. And we just went through the US midterm. I think Trump is finished, and we've got to watch DeSantis now. But these pressures feed back onto the US. But if we say, look, let's work towards a multipolar world, I think the transition will be much easier for all of us. And if we have that framework, when we look at techno-nationalism, I think everything will fall into place in a more relaxed way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yeo. I would now like to invite Dr. Posen back on stage for his response, followed by the discussion with the audience. If you have any questions in the audience, please proceed to the microphones in the aisles or raise your hand so one of our ushers can come to you with a microphone. Online participants are invited to leave their questions in the chat box. Please identify yourself with your name, title, and organization.
Thank you very much, George. Even for those of us who sort of knew what was coming, given your history of forthright speaking, that was striking and useful, and in some ways inspiring. I wanted to just take a couple minutes to offer some reactions as a feed into our discussion. The first one being, perhaps appropriately, perhaps intentionally, there was almost no discussion of economics in your talk. And in an important way, what we're trying to do with the Next Step Conference and maybe have ideas for is not just the agency of what we'll call third countries besides the US, besides China, but the agency of civil society, of commerce, of non-governmental actors. And I know in your career you had much to do with them, both frustratingly at Cancun and more constructively in other contexts. But I think I want to throw a bit of a challenge out there to our participants, which is how much, whatever the US government does on the security side, whatever China's long-term proclivities from its history for its rulers, what can be shaped in the world through action of businesses, of NGOs, of movements, of popular movements? You seem a little down on democracy, perhaps because yesterday's elections were less disastrous than I feared. I'm a little more up on democracy than I was 24 hours ago. But leaving aside the domestic political institutions, I'd like to challenge us to think a bit about what can be done across borders in a non-state to state and certainly non-military intelligence to military intelligence way. A second theme, which I think you argued very powerfully, is the idea that most technologies eventually leach out, was the phrase you said. And of course, this is very true. My favorite examples are the Manufacturers Acts, which tried to keep spinning technology and other mechanical technologies present in the UK and not elsewhere, and Germany and the US successfully stole the technologies and reverse engineered them and created their industries. Or in the GMO intellectual property of the day, British colonialists stealing via Hong Kong Chinese tea so that it could be grown in India rather than only in China. And of course, the most famous example that the US tried to protect the secrets of the atomic bomb and the H-bomb later, and both of them, Russia and China and others, were able to get. So I think your point is well taken. The flip side of that is not just fatalism, but maybe something bigger. What we've seen with respect to Ukraine, with respect to Singapore and Taiwan, with respect to the poor performance of Russia on the battlefield, is that it's not just having the equipment, it's having the systems and the soldiers and the society that lets you use these things well. That's part of the reason, thank God it hasn't been tested, but Singapore or Taiwan are seen as having some credible defense capability, even though they're inherently islands and very small. Their societies can make good use of their military capacities. So again, what I'm wondering is, are there things we can do to build resilience in that sense, or to take comfort that China is not Russia, certainly in any way, but that simply size does not necessarily mean capability? A third issue I just wanted to raise before we open it up for questions, and of course any further comments you'd like to make, is the characterization you give of the US. You know, there is sort of an awkwardness to me as a token American speaking on this in this context, because there's the natural amour propre interest that even though in the US I'm seen as a very sharp critic of the government, that once one's abroad, one doesn't say bad things about one's own country and all that. But I guess I'm not going to idealize the US, and I certainly agree with you that the decisions made for the US to withdraw from globalization, which I and Peterson Institute colleagues have been documenting for several years, is a mistake, and it costs others. So, but my question is, and I support the idea of there being a multipolar world, but can it work if there is no motivating ideal or narrative behind the non-Chinese, non-American forces? I mean, it's enough to say India or Singapore, or for that matter, Germany is rationally going to try to balance 60-40, 70-30, 50-50, depending on its circumstances. But even if it was always hypocritical and always somewhat self-serving, part of the reason your generation and my generation did look at the US as good was at least the professed ideals of the system were attractive. Does it matter? Can those ideals outlive the US? Is there an alternative set of ideals? Anyway, these are just some of the thoughts that come to me in the context of our discussion out of your brilliant remarks. If you'd like, you don't have to. You can get better questions from the audience, but you're welcome to respond to that, or we can go to the to the audience discussion.
Well, Adam, let me respond to you in a general way with my experience in Abu Dhabi recently. It was at the Sir Baniyas Forum, which is organized annually,
Yes.
Jointly with a US think tank. I was pleasantly surprised by the large Israeli turnout. So there was former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, Chief of Defense Forces Gabi Ashkenazi, Chipi Livni, and others. They were there. And the evening's gala performance were by Israeli musicians. After the conference, some of us were brought to have a sneak look at the Abrahamic Center being built in Abu Dhabi, which is a lovely complex consisting of a mosque, a church, and a synagogue, side by side, in a triangle, one facing east, one facing Jerusalem, one facing Mecca. In Abu Dhabi a few years ago, Pope Francis met the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Ahmad bin Taib, under the auspices of the Emir, MBZ, issued a statement on our common humanity. After that, the Pope issued an encyclical called Fratelli Tutti, all brothers. And the Grand Imam enjoined all Muslims to treat Christians living in their midst, not as minorities, but as brothers and sisters. So when we talk about the role of NGOs, of civil society, of small countries, they are almost the conscience of big countries. That you can't just deal in real politics and real economic and interest. There is such a thing as morality. There's such a thing as the little person on the side who's not dust, but also part of the human story. And I think the more we are reminded of that, the more we internalize limits to our actions. It's a short answer to your question.
It's very good.
But I'm by no means downplaying the importance of small countries like Singapore.
Right.
Of course, we have a pretty modest view of ourselves. But I must say I was uncomfortable when you more than once spoke of Ukraine, Taiwan, and Singapore in the same breath. Yes, we have some sympathies for Ukraine because Ukraine is not a small country, but compared to Russia, it is a small country. So we have certain sympathy for the underdog. But we also know that if we get involved in big power conflict, then things will happen, which we'd rather not happen. But Taiwan is different. Taiwan is profoundly different, and we should not speak of Taiwan in the same breath. The Ukrainians are fighting for Ukraine. Singaporeans, I believe, will fight for Singapore. I don't think Taiwanese will fight for Taiwan, because deep inside they know they're Chinese, and that this conflict is not their conflict. It's a conflict between China and America. Yeah. And plus the fact that, and it's not an unimportant fact, that all of us have professed repeatedly that we recognize only one China, and that Beijing is the sole legal representative of China.
What you just said could spark a very long debate. I'm going to try to resist the urge, so if anybody online has questions, please file them in the chat box. But I will just say, part of what scares me about your saying that is twofold. First, you seem to have a very ethnic identity view of who gets to differ, who doesn't get to differ, who's worth saving. Singapore, of course, has very deliberately been a multi-ethnic society. Are you saying, I'm sure you're not, but are you saying Chinese people in Singapore ultimately belong to China? Or what makes it different in Taiwan? And the second thing that makes me scared about what you said is, so is the, whatever, 50, 60% who vote for the non-Kuomintang parties, are they just delusional? Do their votes betray something you just find objectionable? Is that to be ignored?
So despite saying that we should not go down that path,
yes,
you're inviting me to go down that path, maybe just a little, just a little. Well, you know, Chiang Kai-shek was in Cairo. The return of Taiwan to China was affirmed both in Yalta and in Potsdam, and would have happened but for the Korean War. And the Republic of China is all China, the Constitution, and includes Mongolia. So I don't think we should begin to talk about the legitimacy of an independent Taiwan, because I think that is not rooted in fact and in history. It's not just culture. I mean, there are Chinese people all over the world.
Right.
It's not just culture. But in the case of Taiwan, it was the manner in which Taiwan was taken from being China through war, Shimonoseki, and then with the defeat of Japan, agreed by everybody that it should be returned to China, but never returned to China. So from the viewpoint of the Chinese, this is something which is a matter of justice, of what is right. And when they see the US playing a game on Taiwan, while on the one hand affirming one China, but on the other hand actually making moves that suggest that they don't really agree with that, then naturally the Chinese become very suspicious, and thinking it to be a card which can be played. Kissinger reminds all of us that when he negotiated with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong, however the discussion went, it came back to Taiwan. And so he wrote the formulation that Chinese on both sides of the strait recognize only one China. So if we depart from that, which is a bedrock of Sino-American relations, thinking that it is something which can be played, we may suddenly, without our intending it, bring down a whole structure built upon what the Chinese thought was bedrock.
Okay, let me open it up for questions from our audience. Please, over there. If you could identify yourself, please, before speaking, even if you're world famous and everybody knows you, please do.
Thank you, Dr. Posen. Thank you, Mr. Yo. I'm Selena Ho from Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Thank you for taking us back to history, to culture, looking at techno-nationalism. I'm intrigued by your references to a multipolar world, but there was no mention at all of a bipolar world, the possibility of a bipolar world. I mean, if we were to look at just comprehensive national strength alone in terms of military might, in terms of economic might, it will look like a bipolar world, just China and the United States with everyone else far behind. But you did not mention any prospects for a bipolar world. What do you think of that as a possibility? And if it's a multipolar world, which I think is also very highly possible, which are the poles? And what are the prospects for stability in a multipolar world? Because neorealism predicts that bipolarity is the most stable form of world order. So if you could tell us and elaborate a little bit on your multipolar view of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
I don't think we should be too anxious about multipolarity, because for most of human history, the world was multipolar. It cannot be bipolar because, I mean, India's population will soon overtake that of China. In time, it will become the world's second largest economy, or third. Europe, despite its relative decline, has such an incredible richness in its diversity that it will always play a major role in the development of human civilization. I always felt that Europe contributed the most to global civilization. And in Americas, there were two models of people coming together, the US and Brazil. And Brazil, despite its current problems, I think will always be a separate pole. Africa, the picture is still not very clear, but eventually poles will emerge around Nigeria and around South Africa, and maybe around Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda, that part. I think that is natural. And it's like the solar system. There are all kinds of heavenly bodies. There's Jupiter, there's Mars, there are moons around Saturn, moons around Jupiter, there are asteroid belts, there are free-floating meteors. I think it makes for a more beautiful world, and it makes for a better world. And in the process, we learn from each other. We develop faster because there are different fountains of knowledge and experimentation. The challenge is a moral one, that we don't kill each other. And ultimately, all this turns upon the moral question of how we see each other as human beings in our competition.
Thank you. I regret to say that I've been told we have to start the next session at 9:30 sharp, which according to the screen is in 30 seconds. So I'm sorry I will not be able to recognize another question. It just leaves us, we'll be going right into another session directly on these topics, on the big picture of national security and economics of sanctions and in the real world. So please join me in thanking the visionary speaker, George Yeo.
Thank you, Mr. Yeo and Dr. Posen, for the wonderful and insightful conversation. With that, we have come to the end of our first session. Up next is part one of panel one, Economic Security and Innovation. Is bifurcation in emerging technology inevitable? We ask for your patience as we set up for the next session. Some housekeeping notes for the remainder of the conference. If you require assistance at any time during the conference, you may approach one of the staff members around the ballroom or approach them at the registration table. We ask that you have your name tag on you at all times. The password to the Wi-Fi can be found on your tables and the program, as well as some helpful information for your stay in Singapore can be found at the QR codes on the back of your lanyard.